In the early days, singers had to really make an effort to perform right for the first or second or third time. They'd spend hours and hours in the vocal booth until everything was right. So actually, the act of singing was a real workout, and somehow you can hear this. If you listen to the older records of Quincy Jones and Phil Ramone, or just any other great producer out there, you'd hear that there is usually something to the vocal performance, something you can't really describe. It's almost like you're listening between the lines, if you know what I mean. Some of the successful artists of today wouldn't even have a chance to make an okay sounding performance, because without the trickery, the tools, the voice surgery that we do today, they simply wouldn't be able to sound good enough. Now, I don't want to say that all artists of this century are bad or not good enough anymore. It's just easier for all the more or less talented people to put records out, get recognized, or even be respected as professional singers. Before, we had singers like Bob Dylan, Meat Loaf, and so on, and they were not the greatest vocalists, but they had something to say and obviously became very successful. But these days, we have artists, well, if you were to ask them to go in a studio and sing a song down from top to bottom, make the story work and get the feel for the track right, and last but not least, get the pitch right, all at the same time, I assume many of them would literally fail. What I'd like to say is, with all the advantages with digital editing we have today, we should not forget about the essence of making a good record. We should not get lost in the forest of plugins and tools, spending hours and hours fixing a vocal of an artist who could have stayed a couple more hours getting it right, because I promise you, it will not sound the same. If you correct it after the artist leaves, well, you're not going to have the same energy, the same depth, the same vibe. Usually it takes longer to correct it than if the singer would have spent more time to sing it again. Always make sure that before the singer leaves, you have all you need. Not that you have to bring him unnecessarily back into the studio to recut some of it, unless he really wants to anyway. Now, on vocal dates, I try to make the singer perform the song in its entirety, if possible, making 12 up to 20 takes of the performance. Now, depending on the singer, the good thing about having the singer perform the complete song is during comping the vocal, you rarely have to deal with mismatching of the approach between the different takes. It also makes the artist work harder, and that leads to a better all-around feel for different sections of the song. For instance, the artist will get maybe slightly more emotional in the second verse and maybe more aggressive in the last chorus. That's stuff you would have to take care of somehow later if you track part by part. Now remember, these kinds of fixes aren't easy to do. It's much easier if you already have it there with the right dramatics for the song. On the other hand, it's great practice for the singer. He'll learn the songs like this, and that will help him later when he does his live shows. Now, we tend to get lazy and may even say, well, let's fix it later, let's do that later, and then may even get frustrated to hear the results if we don't spend the right amount of time on the actual session earlier. Now, in the past, you usually recorded all on the same day anyway. Now, these days, you might have weeks in between takes. Now, a producer might say, well, let's do this second verse next week. I want to edit what we have so far. Well, for me, the same rule for any other instrument besides the voice. Making music is all about playing and singing a performance. Just think about it. A stand-up comedian, he can't fake it. He can't do a playback show, and if he did, frankly, nobody would find it funny. Nobody would probably even laugh. They may even leave the theater early and would ask for their money back. It's all about the performance. And if we say that people who are buying records won't care or hear this, I feel that's simply not true. Now, they might not be able to explain in words what a good or bad performance is, but I'm sure they'll hear a difference between a manipulated and tuned vocal that was done by an untalented singer and a performance done by a truly great vocalist. The main difference is in the security. The self-evidence and spontaneity in a performance, well, these are things you just can't fake. Can't fix. You can't edit on a computer and get the real thing. Now, when we auto-tune a vocal, it doesn't necessarily mean that the singer is bad or has a bad pitch. It's more of a part of the way we design music today. Now, in the earlier days, we put tons of reverb and delays on the vocals, but now we tend to keep things more dry and upfront in the mix, and maybe put some auto-tune instead for today's approach. So as the time changes, music and the way we mix changes too. Extremely popular are soft synth, which are pretty much established by most composers and programmers these days. I have to say that some of them are incredibly good sounding, although I found out we're dealing with the same problems that I mentioned earlier with latency. Since I grew up studying the piano and came from a jazz background, I've learned how important phrasing in the playing is. To play with dynamics and the right feel makes music really talk. Of course, that's not only with jazz, but also when you play a bass or a Rhodes part on a pop song. Phrasing is everything. But with most of these software synthesizers, you get delay after hitting a note, and it's a real feel killer. You play a part, and because of the latency, you have to make sure that it feels right while you're playing it. So, I learned for myself that I tend to start playing things earlier when I perform with a plug-in synth, just to make it groove right with the music. But the computer doesn't care, since it only has latency during the act of playing, not on the playback. The bad news is, if I listen back to what I've played, it's all early and doesn't feel right anymore. Now you may say, well, afterwards you're going to quantize it anyway, and then it's all good. Well, that's basically right. After quantizing the part, it will all be in place. True, but since I play so many parts with no timing correction, I have to deal with this issue. And when you start to quantize every keyboard part in a song, things are going to sound stiff and not have much life in the end. Of course, it depends on the musical styles, but let me tell you, like 90% of the music we hear on the radio would allow us to leave some things unquantized. I grew up in a time where you were working in the studio, playing the parts directly to tape. You just had to be able to play the stuff right. I would just like to remind us that we should never forget about what's really important to make good records. Musicians from today's generation grew up with computers and learned things in a different way, and some have almost no knowledge about the real outboard gear, musical treatment, and how to work with different musicians on a session in the same room. It's a shame. I think it's very important to have as much knowledge, know-how, and musical background as possible. You can never learn enough. In each production or recording, you can find something you can pick from, even if they're things you shouldn't do. You know, as Picasso said, a painting is never finished. It just stops in interesting places.